The day Roy Wallace buried his mother, the sky over Calhoun County, Texas, turned the color of a bruise, and he was 22 years old with 5 younger siblings standing behind him in the red dirt, none of them fully understanding that from that morning forward he was all they had. It was the spring of 1879, and the land around their small homestead southeast of Victoria stretched out flat and merciless in every direction, broken only by the occasional live oak that hunched against the wind like an old man with bad knees. Roy had stood at that fresh grave with his hat in his hands and looked down at the mound of dark earth and felt something close over inside his chest like a door swinging shut on rusty hinges. He did not cry. He could not afford to cry. Behind him, Clara, who was 9, had her arms wrapped around Thomas, who was 7, and both of them were making the kind of sounds that children make when they do not yet have words for grief. Beside them stood Eliza, 14 and trying to be stoic, her jaw set hard in a way that reminded Roy painfully of their father before he had gone and gotten himself killed by a rattler 3 years before. Then there were the youngest two, the twins, Samuel and Nora, who had just turned 5 and who kept asking when Mama was coming back from sleeping, and every time one of them asked it, Roy felt the door inside his chest press a little tighter against its frame. He had squared his shoulders that evening, fed all 5 of them cornbread and the last of the salt pork, tucked the little ones into their shared bed in the back room, and then sat at the kitchen table until well past midnight, working through what money was left in the tin box behind the loose board above the fireplace. There was not much. There was a small parcel of land, 28 acres of decent grazing range, a handful of cattle, a milk cow named Bess, 2 horses, a wagon, and a mountain of responsibility that Roy Wallace had never asked for and could not refuse. He learned to cook after a fashion. He learned to mend clothes well enough that the patches were ugly but held. He hired himself out as a ranch hand to the draper spread 3 miles east whenever extra cash was needed, coming home before dark without fail, because there was no one else to make sure the lanterns were lit and the children were safe. He enrolled Eliza and Clara in the schoolhouse in town and walked Thomas there himself until the boy was old enough to walk alongside his sisters. He taught Samuel and Nora their letters on the back of an old feed sack with a charred stick, because there was not always money for paper. The years moved the way hard years do, slowly and all at once. Roy turned 23, then 24, then 25. He grew into the shape of a man who did not complain, tall and lean with shoulders that had been built by constant labor, with hands that were permanently rough, and a face that the sun had turned the color of saddle leather. He was not without a sense of humor, but it had become a dry and quiet thing, something he deployed mostly for the children's benefit, coaxing laughter from Thomas when the boy was scared or making Nora giggle when she was being stubborn about eating her supper. The neighbors knew his situation, and some of them helped when they could. Old Mrs. Kettner 2 miles down the road would occasionally send over a pot of stew with her husband. The Draper family had given him steady work, and had never once docked his pay when he needed to leave early because Clara had a fever or Thomas had taken a fall. Roy was grateful for all of it, but gratitude was its own particular burden, because it required a man to keep count of what he owed and what he could not repay. By the time 1882 rolled around and Roy was 25, the homestead had improved. There were more cattle, a proper garden that Eliza managed with fierce determination, and the house had been expanded with a second room that Roy had built himself, 1 plank at a time on the evenings when there was still light left. Eliza was 17 now, close to a woman grown, and Clara was 12 and sharp as a tack, and Thomas was 10 and useful with the animals in a way that gave Roy genuine pride. Samuel and Nora were 8, and the twins had turned from bewildered babies into a pair of mischief-makers who could find trouble in an empty field. But Roy was tired in a way that sleep did not fix. It was the kind of tired that lived behind the eyes and settled into the bones, the kind that came from carrying something heavy for so long that you could no longer remember what it felt like to set it down. It was in March of 1882 that Reverend Holly's in town mentioned, entirely without being asked, that a young woman back in Missouri had put out a notice through the church correspondence network. She was, the Reverend said, a schoolteacher who had lost her position when the school in her town had closed for lack of funding, and who was willing to travel west to assist a family in need of help with children, in exchange for room and board and whatever small wage could be managed. She was not looking for marriage, the Reverend was careful to add, because apparently she had made that point clearly in her letter. She was looking for honest work. Roy had stood in the yard outside the Reverend's small house with his hat in his hands, which was a habit he had never been able to break, and considered the offer for a long moment. He was a proud man, but he was not a foolish one. He thought about Clara struggling with her reading and Thomas needing someone who could actually teach him his sums properly, and the twins who were running wild in ways that a man working from before sunup until after sundown simply could not address. He thought about Eliza, who was nearly 18 and would likely be looking to her own future before long, and who deserved to have had at least some of her own youth rather than spending it all being a second mother to her younger siblings. He wrote back to the address the Reverend gave him. His letter was plain and honest. He described the land, the children, the situation, and the wage, which was modest enough that he was somewhat embarrassed to write it down. He said he had 5 siblings in his care, and that he was looking for someone to help with their education and general welfare, not someone to take on more than was fair. He signed it Roy Wallace and sent it off with the monthly mail rider, and tried not to think about it too hard after that. Frances Easton received that letter on a gray Tuesday in late March, sitting at the small kitchen table in her older brother's house in Jefferson City, Missouri, where she had been staying since the school had closed, and where she had been quietly, methodically going out of her mind from the combination of idleness and her sister-in-law's well-meaning but relentless attempts to find her a suitable husband among the local church congregation. She was 23 years old, Frances, and she was not a woman who was easy to overlook, though she sometimes wished she were. She had dark auburn hair that she wore pinned up in a practical knot, and eyes the color of Good Creek water on a cloudy day, a grayish-green that shifted with the light, and a quality about her that people often described afterward as composed, though what they usually meant was that she did not rattle easily and she did not perform emotions for the benefit of observers. She had opinions she could defend, and a temper she had learned to keep under reasonable management, and she had loved teaching more than anything else she had ever done, and the loss of her school had left a hollow in her daily life that nothing in Jefferson City had come close to filling. She read Roy Wallace's letter twice, then a third time. It was, she thought, the most honest letter she had ever received from a stranger. There was no embellishment. He did not make the homestead sound better than it was or minimize the difficulty of what he was describing. He said plainly that the work would be hard, and that he could not promise luxury, but that he could promise fair dealing, and that the children were good at heart, even the twins who were presently a trial to everyone's patience. She wrote back the following day. She asked 5 questions, all of them practical: the distance of the homestead from the nearest town, whether there was a proper room she could use, what the children's current level of schooling was, whether she would be expected to do farm labor in addition to teaching, and whether Roy Wallace was a man of his word. That last question, she acknowledged in the letter, was not one he could answer objectively, but she said she had found that the way a man responded to the question told her more than the answer itself. His response arrived in 2 weeks and addressed each question directly and without defensiveness. The homestead was 4 miles from Victoria. There was a room, small but private, off the new addition he had built. The children ranged from barely literate to reasonably capable. He did not expect farm labor, though he said If she happened to know anything about gardening, she was welcome to the garden. And regarding her last question, he wrote that he had been told he was a man of his word by people whose opinions he respected, but that he supposed that was exactly the sort of thing a man of poor character would also write, and that she would simply have to come and see for herself if she was so inclined. Frances had read that last paragraph and laughed out loud for the first time in weeks, a real laugh that surprised her brother across the room. She wrote back and said she would come in April. She arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, rattling in on the stage from Victoria, sitting with her trunk and her two smaller bags and the wooden case that held her teaching materials, and the driver let her off at the road because the stage did not go 4 miles down a ranch road. He pointed her in the general direction and drove off, and Frances Easton stood on the side of that Texas road in the warm April air and looked at the open country and felt, instead of the fear that might have been reasonable, something that was startlingly close to relief. She was carrying one of her bags and looking for some sign of the Wallace homestead when she heard the creak of a wagon coming along the road behind her. She turned and saw a man driving a pair of bay horses, sitting straight on the wagon seat with the ease of someone who had been doing it his entire life. He was closer to 6 feet than not, with dark hair under a worn felt hat and the kind of jaw that looked like it had been set firmly some years ago and had never quite relaxed since. He pulled the horses up alongside her and looked down at her with brown eyes that were direct and unhurried. "Miss Easton," he said. "Mr. Wallace," she said back, because she had not expected him to be there, but she had also not expected him not to be, and she refused to be thrown by either. He stepped down from the wagon with the economy of movement she would come to recognize as characteristic of him, picked up her trunk without asking permission, and loaded it into the wagon bed alongside 2 sacks of flour and a crate of dry goods. He helped her up to the wagon seat and went around to the other side and climbed up and gathered the reins, and they started down the road in the late afternoon light without ceremony. "The stage driver didn't want to take the side road," she said. "He never does," Roy said. "I should have been there earlier to meet you. I was held up at the general store." "It was fine," she said. "I've stood on a road before." He glanced at her sideways, and she thought she saw the very edge of something that might have been appreciation for that answer move across his face and then disappear. "The children know you're coming," he said. "Clara has talked about nothing else for 3 days. I should warn you, the twins are a project." "Most 8-year-olds are," she said. "These particular 8-year-olds are exceptional," he said. "I say that with full affection and considerable exhaustion." She laughed, and he looked at her again, this time a little longer, and then returned his eyes to the road. She met all 5 of them that evening in the golden hour before supper, standing in the yard while Roy unhitched the horses. Eliza came out first, composed and measuring, with sharp eyes that took Frances apart and reassembled her in about 15 seconds. Clara pushed past Eliza with no such formality, and launched directly into a detailed account of her reading troubles in a way that made her immediately and completely endearing. Thomas held back, his thumbs hooked in his suspenders, trying to look older than 10, and then Samuel and Nora came tearing out of the barn with mud on their boots and straw in their hair, arguing at full volume about something that appeared to involve a frog. Frances looked at all 5 of them and felt the hollow in her chest begin, very slightly, to fill. She settled into the small room off the new addition, which was indeed small but had a window that faced east and a quilt on the narrow bed that someone had clearly washed and pressed before her arrival, and she suspected that had been Eliza. She put her teaching case on the single shelf, arranged her few personal belongings on the small table beside the bed, and sat on the edge of the mattress and listened to the sounds of the house around her, which were the sounds of children and cooking and someone outside splitting wood with patient, rhythmic strokes. She was not naive about what this arrangement was. She was help. She was hired help with a more dignified title, and Roy Wallace was her employer, a man with responsibilities so large they had aged him past his years in ways that showed in the set of his shoulders and the lines at the corners of his eyes. She had told the Reverend back in Jefferson City, and she had told everyone who had asked, that she was not coming to Texas to find a husband. She had meant it sincerely. She had no idea, sitting on that narrow bed in the fading April light, how thoroughly she was about to be wrong. The first month was about establishing order. Frances assessed the children's various levels of learning with the efficiency of someone who had been teaching for 4 years and knew how to see past a child's defenses to what was actually going on underneath. Clara could read simple sentences, but lost the thread of longer passages and needed practice more than instruction. Thomas had natural arithmetic ability that no one had properly recognized and nurtured, and once Frances put a real problem in front of him, the kind that required thinking rather than rote repetition, he lit up in a way that she made a note to tell Roy about. Samuel was bright and scattered and learned better when she gave him something to do with his hands while she talked, so she let him fiddle with a small piece of rope or a handful of dried beans while she read to him, and his retention improved markedly. Nora was the reader of the twins, devouring words with an appetite that Frances found delightful, already pulling ahead of her brother in that particular area, though Samuel surpassed her at figures. Eliza was the complicated one. At 17, she was too old for the kind of structured lessons Frances was giving the younger children, and too young to be excluded without feeling the slight of it. Frances navigated this carefully. She started lending Eliza books from her own case, real books, novels and a collection of essays, and a botany text that Eliza became quietly obsessed with, and they developed a habit of talking about what Eliza was reading in the evenings after the younger ones were in bed. It was not teaching exactly. It was closer to conversation between equals, and Frances could see it meant something to Eliza that she was being treated that way. Roy watched all of this from the edges of his days. He was up before first light and rarely at rest until well after dark, but he noticed. Frances discovered this about him incrementally, that he was one of those people who appeared not to be paying attention, but were in fact paying the closest kind of attention, filing everything away and thinking it through at length before he said or did anything about it. He did not hover over her work with the children. He did not second-guess her methods or tell her that, in his experience, a different approach was better. He simply observed, and occasionally, usually at supper, he would ask her a question about how something was going with one of the children, a real question with thought behind it, and when she answered he listened with the full weight of his attention, which was the kind of listening that most people never offered to anyone. It was the 3rd week of May when the first real conversation happened between them, meaning the first one that was not about the children or the household logistics. It was evening and the children were in bed and she had come outside for some air, the Texas nights being remarkable in their depth and their stars, and she had found Roy sitting on the porch steps with his back against the post and his long legs stretched out, looking at the dark shape of the range. She sat down on the top step and said, "Do you ever get a night that's just yours?" He was quiet for a moment. "Not often," he said. "I'm used to it." "That's not quite the same as it being all right," she said. He turned his head and looked at her in the darkness, and she could not see his expression clearly, but there was something in the quality of the silence that followed that told her the observation had landed somewhere real. "No," he said after a moment, "I suppose it's not." "How long has it been?" she asked. "Since your mother passed." 3 years come August," he said, "and before that your father was already gone." 3 years before that, yes. She looked out at the stars. "That's a long time to be the one holding everything together." "Someone had to," he said, and it was not self-pity, it was simply fact, stated in the same tone he used to report that it needed to rain soon or the garden would suffer. "Yes," she said, "but that doesn't mean it isn't hard." "No," he said again, quieter this time. "It doesn't." They sat there for a while longer without speaking, and it was comfortable in the way that silence is comfortable only between two people who have begun, without quite deciding to trust one another. She started noticing other things after that. The way he was with the little ones, specifically the way he managed to be firm without being cold and gentle without being soft, which was a balance that most people never figured out with children, and that Roy Wallace had clearly worked out through years of daily reckoning. He could tell from 20 feet away when one of the twins was winding up toward a meltdown and redirect the situation before it happened. He could read Thomas's silences, which were many and various, the way a tracker reads ground sign, knowing which ones meant the boy was fine and which ones meant something needed attention. He carved things in the evenings. Small animals mostly, horses and dogs, and once a little cat that he set on Nora's pillow without saying anything, and Nora found it and went absolutely wild with delight. He did not carve with any particular artistry, but with care, and the care was its own kind of beauty. Frances noticed all of this and tried not to read too much into it. She was aware of what happened to women who read too much into the domestic kindnesses of the men who employed them. She had seen it go badly, had a cousin whose story had not ended well, and she reminded herself with regularity, a practical woman with clear eyes and a clear purpose. The summer came on hot and relentless, as Texas summers do, and the work on the homestead intensified. Roy started bringing in extra horses to break and train for a neighboring rancher named Caldwell, which was good money, but meant he was often working in the corral from morning until his arms were trembling with exhaustion. Frances began helping with the evening meal more consistently, partly because Eliza had enough on her plate, and partly because it gave her something useful to do when the children were working on their lessons, and she discovered that she was a better cook than she had given herself credit for. One afternoon in late June, she was in the kitchen with Clara when they heard a crash from the direction of the corral, and then a shout, not a scream but the sharp bark of a man in sudden pain. Frances was out the door before she had decided to move. She found Roy sitting against the corral fence with his right hand pressed to his left forearm. One of the horses Caldwell had sent over, a big gray with an ugly disposition, was at the far end of the corral looking entirely unrepentant. There was blood coming through Roy's fingers, not catastrophic, but meaningful. "It bit me," Roy said, with an expression of such genuine indignation that Frances nearly laughed and managed not to. "The miserable animal bit me." "Let me see," she said. "It's fine," he said. "Roy," she said, using his name directly for the first time, and something in her tone apparently communicated that she was not asking. He moved his hand and let her look. The bite had broken the skin in a ragged line along the inside of his forearm and was bleeding steadily. It needed to be cleaned and wrapped. "Come inside," she said. He came without further argument, which told her it hurt more than he was admitting. She sat him at the kitchen table and got the medicine tin from the shelf and cleaned the wound with carbolic and water, while he sat with the particular rigid stillness of a man trying not to show that something hurts. His arm on the table in front of her was dark tan to the elbow and lighter above, rope-muscled and scarred in several small places from years of ranch work, and she was aware, as she worked, of the warmth of his skin under her hands and the closeness of him and the way he was looking at the side of her face. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I'm already doing it," she said, wrapping a strip of clean linen around the wound. "There. Can you work tomorrow?" "I'll need to," he said. "Then rest it today. Eliza can manage the children this afternoon." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're not much like what I expected," he said. She tied off the bandage and looked up at him and found that his eyes were considerably closer than she had realized, and that they were warm and dark and looking at her with something that was not quite an employer looking at hired help. "What did you expect?" she said. "I'm not entirely sure," he said. "Someone more cautious, maybe, more concerned with the proprieties." "I'm concerned with plenty of proprieties," she said. "I just don't put them ahead of common sense." The corner of his mouth moved, the small, restrained version of a smile that she had come to recognize as his genuine one. "No," he said, "I don't suppose you do." She became aware that she was still holding his arm and set it down carefully on the table and stood up and began putting the medicine tin back in order. And that was when she first acknowledged to herself, quietly and with some alarm, that her feelings on the subject of Roy Wallace were beginning to drift in a direction that she had specifically said they would not go. She did not act on this acknowledgement in any outward way. She was a composed woman, and she was also a sensible one. And sensible women did not moon over their employers, particularly employers who had not given any clear indication of feeling anything beyond ordinary gratitude and perhaps the early formation of friendly regard. She threw herself into the work with the children with renewed energy and was particularly pleasant and efficient in her professional conduct, which was, she recognized with some amusement, possibly overcorrecting. The summer wore on. There were good days and hard days and the occasional terrible one, like the afternoon in July when a thunderstorm came up fast without warning and Frances and the children were caught out in the field east of the house, having gone to look at a hawk's nest that Thomas had found in a live oak. They made it back to the house soaked through and laughing and muddy, all 6 of them piling through the door at once, and Roy, who had been nailing down a loose board on the barn and had seen the storm coming and ridden hard back to the house, arrived to find them already inside and safe, and Frances trying to get 5 wet children out of their clothes without causing a general riot. He stood in the doorway dripping and looking at her where she stood in the middle of the kitchen chaos, organizing towels and boots and children with the calm efficiency of someone who had managed worse, and the expression that crossed his face in that moment was not the restrained corner-mouth movement. It was something fuller and warmer than that, something that was there and visible before he had a chance to contain it, and Frances saw it and felt it go through her like a stone dropped in still water. "Everyone all right," he said. "Everyone is excellent," she said. "We saw the hawk, the storm was dramatic, and Samuel has mud in his ear. All in all, a successful afternoon." He laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded and full, and she had not heard it before, and she found she very much wanted to hear it again. After that, Roy began making small adjustments to his days that brought him into the house more often during the hours that Frances was there. He did not do this in an obvious way. It was always attended by a reasonable excuse. He needed a cup of water, or there was something he wanted to tell Eliza, or he was checking on how Thomas was progressing with a particular arithmetic problem. But Frances noticed, because Frances noticed most things, and the noticing was warm in a way that she had stopped trying to argue herself out of. In August, something happened that shifted the whole arrangement of things between them. It was a Saturday, and the children had been invited to a neighbor's property for the day, a family named Ortega with children of roughly corresponding ages who had become good friends of the Wallace siblings over the summer. Roy drove them over in the wagon and returned alone, which meant the homestead was, for the first time since Frances had arrived, entirely without anyone else in it. She was in the garden when he came back, pulling weeds from between the bean rows, which she had taken over from Eliza in June and which had become, she would admit to no one, a source of genuine pride. She heard the wagon and stood and stretched her back and looked up, and Roy was walking toward her through the afternoon light, and there was something different about the way he was moving, less purposeful than usual, like a man without a specific task who is nevertheless inexorably drawn in a particular direction. He stopped at the garden fence and hooked his arms over the top rail and looked at her. "How are the beans?" he said. "Better than last month," she said. "I think whatever was eating the leaves gave up." "Good," he said. She went back to weeding, and he stayed at the fence and did not say anything for a bit, and then he said, "Frances." It was the first time he had used her given name, and she registered it immediately, a slight warmth rising in her face that she was grateful her hat brim partially hid. "Yes," she said. "I wanted to say something," he said, and stopped. She waited. She had learned that Roy Wallace said things eventually if you gave him room for them. "I don't think I said adequately when you first came how much this has mattered," he said. "What you've done with the children, the difference it's made." I know it's your work and you're paid for it, but it's been more than that, and I wanted you to know that I know that." She straightened up and looked at him. He was looking back at her with that steady, unhurried attention of his, and there was something in his eyes that went considerably beyond gratitude, and she thought he knew it too. "I didn't come here for adequacy," she said. "I came because I needed work, and your letter was the most honest thing I'd read in a long time." "My letter was plain because I don't know how to be otherwise," he said. "That's not a deficiency," she said. "I know you said you weren't looking for anything beyond the work," he said carefully. "When you wrote to the Reverend, I want to be clear that I'm not pressing you toward anything you don't want." She looked at him steadily, and the afternoon light was warm and the beans were growing, and there was the smell of dry grass and Texas summer all around them, and she thought that composure was a very useful quality except in the moments when it prevented you from being honest. "That was 4 months ago," she said. "People are allowed to discover they were wrong about things." The silence that followed had a different texture from all the previous silences. Roy's hands tightened on the top rail and he looked at her very carefully, like a man checking his footing before stepping onto uncertain ground. "Are you saying you were wrong?" he asked. "I'm saying I'm not entirely sure I was right," she said, "which is as far as I'm prepared to go today." He held her gaze for a long moment and then nodded slowly, as if he was accepting terms that were more than fair. "That's more than sufficient," he said. He did not press the matter further that day, which she had expected he would not. He went to repair the fence on the south side of the property, and she went back to the beans, and they had supper together that evening when the children came home. All the noise and confusion and laughter of 5 young people recounting their day around the table. And underneath all of it there was something different between her and Roy. Something that had been named without being named, that sat quietly between them like a warm coal in a dark room. September brought the beginning of the school year in Victoria, which meant that Clara and Thomas, and eventually the twins, were now attending the schoolhouse in town on weekdays, which had been one of Frances's goals for them, though she continued to supplement their education at home. The homestead was quieter during school hours and Frances found herself working alongside Eliza more often, the two of them developing a genuine friendship built on mutual respect and the frank, unsentimental conversations that Eliza preferred. It was Eliza who said it first, on a Tuesday morning in mid-September while they were hanging laundry in the yard. "You know Roy looks at you the way Pa used to look at Mama," she said without preamble, the way Eliza said most things. Frances kept her hands occupied with the sheet she was pinning and did not look at Eliza directly. "That's a significant observation," she said. "I know what I see," Eliza said. "I just thought you should know what it looks like from the outside." "What does it look like from the outside?" Frances asked. Eliza considered. "Like a man who has been walking a long road alone, discovering he might not have to walk it alone anymore," she said, "and being very careful about it because he's not sure he deserves to want anything for himself." Frances looked at her then. Eliza was hanging a shirt and her face was calm and 17 and much older than 17. "Where did you get so wise?" Frances asked. "From watching Roy," Eliza said simply. "You learn a lot about people from watching someone carry more than they should have to carry." Frances thought about that for the rest of the day. That evening after supper, while Eliza helped the younger children with their schoolwork at the kitchen table, Frances stepped outside onto the porch and Roy was there, as he increasingly was in these hours, sitting on the steps with a piece of wood and his carving knife, working on something small in the dying light. She sat down beside him and closer than she usually did, not touching but close, and he glanced at her and then went back to his work. "What are you carving?" she asked. "Not sure yet," he said. "It'll tell me when it gets there." She smiled at that. "Eliza said something to me today," she said. "Eliza says things," he said. "She said you've been carrying more than you should have to carry for a long time," Frances said, "and that you aren't sure you deserve to want anything for yourself." Roy was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not respond. He was working the knife in small, careful strokes, curls of pale wood falling onto his boot. Finally he said, "Eliza's too smart for her own good sometimes." "Is she wrong?" Frances said. Another long pause. "No," he said, "probably not." She turned so she was looking at him, at the line of his jaw in the last of the light and the way his hands moved with the wood, careful and deliberate. "I want to tell you something," she said, "and I want you to hear it as it's meant, without looking for any more in it than I'm saying and without dismissing it either." He set down the knife and the wood and turned to look at her, giving her his full attention as he always did when something mattered. "I came here because I needed work," she said. "And I stayed because the children needed me and because the work was good and real. But I have also stayed, these last weeks especially, because I wanted to. Because of this place and these children and because of you. And I am not confused about that or uncertain about it. I am saying it clearly because I think you deserve someone who says things clearly." Roy looked at her for a very long moment, and something moved through his expression that was part relief and part something much more vulnerable than she had seen from him before. "I'm not a man of many words," he said. "I know," she said. "But I want you to know," he said slowly, "that since you arrived, for the first time in longer than I can clearly remember, I have thought about something other than what needs to be done next. I've thought about you, about what you said the day before or what you'll say tomorrow or the way you look when you're thinking about something. And I don't entirely know what to do with that because I haven't had the room for it in a long time." "You don't have to do anything with it right now," she said. "No," he said. "I know." He was quiet again, and then he said, "Would you mind if I called on you? In the proper way, I mean. In the evenings after the children are in bed, just talking." "I would not mind that at all," she said. He picked his carving back up, and after a moment she saw that it was going to be a bird, a small hawk with wings half folded. He worked in silence beside her, and the stars came out one by one over the Texas dark, and it was one of the better evenings of her life. October in Calhoun County was a relief after the summer's heat, the air cooler and drier, the light going golden in a way that made the whole landscape look like something from a painting. Roy called on her in the evenings as he had said, and what it meant in practice was that they sat on the porch or at the kitchen table after the household was quiet and talked, really talked, in the way that two people do when they are discovering each other, when every piece of information about the other person is interesting and nothing is too small. He told her about his parents, about his father who had been a good man and a poor rancher, better with animals than with the business of animals, and about his mother who had held the homestead together by sheer force of determined love and who had made Roy promise on her sickbed that the children would stay together and would have their chances. He told her about the night after his mother's burial when he had sat at the kitchen table and done the accounting and understood for the first time what the next years would require of him, and how he had not felt brave but had simply understood that there was no alternative. She told him about Jefferson City and the school, and the 4 years she had spent teaching other people's children, and how it had been the most satisfying work she had ever known, and how the loss of it had felt like a personal failure even though it had not been. She told him about her parents, who were good people but conventional people for whom her insistence on working rather than marrying had been a source of patient exasperation. She told him about the sense she had had when she stepped off the stage in Victoria, standing on the side of that road in the April air, that she had arrived somewhere that might mean something, though she had not been able to say at the time what it was. He listened to all of it the way he listened to everything that mattered to him, with the whole of his attention, and when he responded, he did not say reflexive, comforting things. He said true things, carefully considered, and she found this more comforting than any reflexive kindness could have been. One evening in mid-October, it was cool enough for a small fire in the kitchen hearth, and they were sitting near it with cups of coffee, and he had been talking about Eliza and how he wanted her to have the chance to choose her own life rather than spending it keeping the homestead, and Frances said without planning to, "She'll be all right, Roy. They all will." You've given them a foundation most children never have." He looked at the fire and then at her and said, "I worry that I got it wrong more than I got it right." "Everyone who takes care of children worries that," she said. "The ones who don't worry about it are the ones who got it wrong." He was quiet a moment and then he said, "You're very easy to talk to." "I've been told that," she said. "No, I mean specifically easy for me," he said. "I'm not a man who talks. Ask anyone in this county. I go weeks without more than necessary words. With you I can't seem to manage necessary words. There are always more." She looked at him across the small fire-lit kitchen and felt the warmth of the hearth and the warmth of what was very clearly happening between them and said, "I don't want fewer words from you, Roy." He said, "Good." And then he said after a moment, "Frances." "Yes." "May I?" he said, and then he stopped, which was unusual for him even in his measured way, and she could see him choosing words with particular care. "May I take your hand?" She looked down at her own hands around the coffee cup and then up at him and said, "Yes." He reached across the small space between their chairs and took her hand in his, which was warm and rough and careful, and they sat like that by the fire for a while, and it was as uncomplicated and as overwhelming as anything she had ever experienced. They did not rush after that. Roy was a deliberate man and Frances was a careful woman, and together they moved at the pace of people who have decided something matters and therefore will not be careless with it. There was a quality of courtship about the evenings on the porch or by the fire, a proper and tender quality, and the children were both perceptive and diplomatic about it in their various ways. Clara thought it was wonderful and said so repeatedly. Thomas became approximately 10% more cooperative in general, as though the homestead being happier made everything easier. Eliza was satisfied in the quiet way of someone who has been right about something. Samuel and Nora simply started taking it for granted that Frances sat next to Roy at supper, with the adaptability of 8-year-olds who accept new facts of life without excessive commentary. In November, Caldwell came by to discuss the horses Roy had trained and to offer him a longer-term arrangement, which would mean more money and more work, but would also mean Roy could begin to think about expanding the herd in a meaningful way. He sat at the kitchen table with Roy and talked for an hour, and Frances kept the children out of the way with admirable efficiency. And afterward Roy told her about the offer and what he was considering, and she listened and asked 2 or 3 questions that he had not asked himself and that were good questions. And when he had thought them through he looked at her and said, "Thank you." "For what?" she said. "For thinking about it with me," he said. "I'm not used to thinking out loud with someone." "You should get used to it," she said. He held her gaze for a moment and then nodded, as if he had decided something. "I intend to," he said. He accepted Caldwell's offer, and the additional work brought additional strain but also the beginning of genuine financial stability, the kind that Roy had been working toward for 3 years and had not quite reached. He bought new boots for Thomas, who had been walking around in a pair with holes in them with complete, uncomplaining dignity. He bought fabric for Clara to have a new dress made, and Clara spent approximately a week making decisions about the color. He paid Frances a slightly better wage than he had been managing before, and she protested, and he said, "You've earned it and then some, and I don't want to hear any different." December came in cold and dry, the wind off the range cutting through everything. Christmas on the Wallace homestead that year was the best it had been since the parents were alive, by unanimous unspoken agreement. Frances had written to Jefferson City and had her mother send down a package of small things, ribbons and a book of fairy stories, and a tin of proper hard candy that her mother had made, the kind with peppermint in it. Roy cut a juniper branch and put it in the corner of the kitchen, and the children decorated it with things they made themselves, paper stars and twisted pieces of wire, and a small clay bird that Samuel had made in a fit of artistic ambition. Frances hung a length of red ribbon on the mantel, and it made the kitchen look, for the duration of December, like a place where warmth was the primary industry. On Christmas Eve, the children went to bed reluctantly and at length, and Roy and Frances sat by the hearth as had become their custom, and it was different that evening in a way that was in the air before either of them put it into words. He was sitting closer to her than usual, the two chairs angled toward each other and toward the fire, and at some point he had taken her hand and was holding it in the absent-minded way of someone who has begun to do a thing without needing to think about it, which was, Frances thought, its own kind of telling. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Then ask it," she said. He looked at the fire for a moment and then directly at her with the clear, steady look that was his most characteristic expression. "I know you came here for work," he said. "I know you were building your own life, your own kind of life before all of this. I'm not a man with a great deal to offer beyond what you can already see, which is a small homestead and a large number of Wallace children and a considerable amount of ongoing work." "Roy," she said. "Let me finish," he said with a small, rueful smile. "I'm trying to be honest with you, which is, as you once told me, not a deficiency, but I want you to understand that I know what I'm asking and what it means. I am asking whether you might consider staying, not as help, as mine. Whether you would marry me." The fire crackled, and the December wind moved outside, and Frances sat in the warm kitchen with the man who had carried the weight of 5 children for 3 years without complaint and without breaking, and whose hands were gentle, and whose mind was honest, and whose laugh she had been collecting like currency since the summer. And she thought that she had left Jefferson City to find work and had found, by some extraordinary alignment of circumstances and letters, and one stage ride down a Texas road. Something far more difficult to name and far more worth having. "Yes," she said, "I would be very willing to marry you." He looked at her for a moment as though he wanted to be sure he had heard correctly, and then the full smile came, the one he very rarely gave, and it changed his face completely, and she thought she would remember that smile for the rest of her life because it was the smile of a man who had not expected to be this happy. He leaned forward and kissed her, gently and deliberately, the way he did everything that mattered to him, and her hand tightened in his, and outside the wind was cold, and inside the kitchen was warm, and Christmas was coming, and 5 children were asleep in the next room. They told the children on Christmas morning, and the responses were, in their various ways, entirely in character. Clara screamed with delight and threw her arms around Frances, and then around Roy, and then around Frances again. Thomas went brick red and shook Roy's hand with great solemnity, apparently having decided this required a formal response, before dropping the formality and grinning. Eliza hugged Frances properly and looked at Roy with an expression of deep satisfaction. Samuel looked at his twin and said, "I told you," and Nora said, "You did not tell me, I told you," and they argued about it happily for several minutes, which amounted to their endorsement of the proceedings. The wedding was simple and real and exactly what both of them wanted. It was the 4th of February, 1883, a clear cold day, and Reverend Hollies came out to the homestead because Roy did not see why they should have to drive to town for the business when the home was where the life was. Frances wore her best dress, a deep green wool, and Roy wore his good coat and had clearly made efforts with his hair. All 5 children stood as witnesses. Old Mrs. Kettner and her husband came from down the road. The Ortega family came. Caldwell and his wife came, the latter bringing a wedding cake that was so elaborate it seemed to have been made by someone operating under the sincere belief that no celebration was complete without 3 layers and a great deal of white frosting. They said their vows in the kitchen by the hearth, because it was too cold for the porch, and Roy's voice was steady and quiet and completely sincere, and Frances's voice was clear and direct, the way she did everything she meant. Afterward there was food and the wedding cake, and the children ran wild around the yard with the Ortega children, while the adults sat in the kitchen and the 2 front rooms and talked, and Roy and Frances found themselves at some point standing together at the edge of the gathering, a little apart from the noise, and Roy had his arm around her and she was leaning into his side, and it felt like something that had always been or should have. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly near her ear. "I'm extraordinary," she said. His arm tightened around her briefly and he did not say anything, which was entirely sufficient. The first year of their marriage had the quality of something being built in real time, two people learning the particular architecture of a shared life, the way their habits and preferences and needs fitted or needed fitting. Roy had lived for years with children and without any adult who was specifically, consistently, his own, and there was an adjustment in that, coming home to find that there was someone in the house who was there for him specifically, someone he could tell about his day without needing to phrase it for the ears of a 9-year-old. Frances was learning the rhythms of a working homestead in a way that being hired help had not fully required, learning the weight of it and the satisfaction of it, and the way the good days were very good, and the hard days were genuinely hard. They were good partners. This was perhaps the most fundamental fact of their marriage and the one that sustained everything else. They argued occasionally, because Frances had opinions and Roy had convictions, and these did not always align, but their arguments had a certain productive quality, because neither of them was interested in winning over being right, and they were both honest enough to change their minds when a better argument was presented. Frances had never in her life expected to enjoy arguing with someone, and was somewhat surprised to find that with Roy she did, because he argued fairly and without cruelty, and he always listened to what she said. By the spring of 1883, Eliza turned 18 and began being courted by a young man named Hector Reyes from a neighboring family, a quiet and decent young man who was clearly serious about his intentions, and who had been making his interest known with patient, respectful persistence since the previous autumn. Roy watched this development with the complex feelings of a brother who had helped raise a sister and now had to let her choose her own direction. Frances helped him with this, talking him through it in the evenings, acknowledging that it was hard and also that it was right. Eliza deserved her own life. She had been half a mother to these children since she was 14. She had earned the right to make her own choices. Eliza and Hector became formally engaged by summer, a fact that Eliza announced with characteristic directness at supper one evening in June, setting down her fork and saying, "Hector has asked me and I've said yes, and I'd like everyone to manage their feelings about it in a civilized fashion." The table was briefly silent. Then Clara burst into tearful happiness. Thomas shook Roy's hand again, apparently having decided this was the correct response to significant announcements, and Samuel told Eliza he liked Hector because Hector was good with horses. Nora said she had known this was coming for months. Roy waited until after supper and found a moment to speak to Eliza alone on the porch, and Frances, watching from the kitchen window, could not hear what he said. But she saw Eliza's face change in the way it changed when something reached past all her composure, and saw Roy put his arms around his sister and hold her, and had to look away for a moment because the tenderness of it was almost too much. He came back inside and sat down at the kitchen table, and Frances brought him a cup of coffee and sat across from him. "All right," she said. "Yes," he said, "then she's going to be fine." "She absolutely is," Frances said. "She's remarkable." "I know," he said. "I just wish she hadn't had to be remarkable under such circumstances." Frances reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "The circumstances made her who she is," she said, "and who she is extraordinary." "You had a hand in that, Roy." He looked at her hand over his and then up at her face and said, "We both did." Frances found in the autumn of 1883 that she was expecting a child. She told Roy on a morning in late October, standing in the kitchen in the early light before the children were awake, and watching his face move through surprise and then something that she could only describe as profound gratitude, a kind of gratitude that went all the way to the bone. He came around the table and held her with a gentleness that was different from anything she had known from him before, careful and fierce at once, and said against her hair, "Are you well? Are you all right?" "I'm very well," she said. "I'm excellent, in fact." "Good," he said. He did not let go for a long moment. "Good." The children's responses were again characteristic. Clara wanted to plan the name immediately and had opinions about 6 of them before breakfast. Thomas got a look of consideration on his face, the same look he wore when working through a math problem, and eventually said that he supposed a baby would be all right. Samuel asked if it would be a boy. Nora said it didn't matter what it was as long as it was clever. All children are clever about different things, Frances told them, which was what she believed and had believed since her first year of teaching. The spring of 1884 was warm and green, the winter rains having been generous. The Wallace homestead was unrecognizable from what it had been when Frances had first come down that road in the wagon seat beside Roy on an April afternoon 2 years before. The house was larger now, a third room having been added over the winter. The cattle herd had grown meaningfully from Roy's arrangement with Caldwell, and the additional land he had managed to acquire at reasonable cost from an elderly neighbor who had decided to move to San Antonio to live with his daughter. There was a proper vegetable garden and a small orchard of peach trees that Frances had planted and which were beginning to produce. The schoolroom, as the children called the large corner of the main room where Frances kept her teaching materials and the children's books, had accumulated a real collection of volumes over 2 years, donated or purchased or borrowed, enough to constitute a genuine library by the standards of a working ranch household. Thomas, at 11, was demonstrating a mathematical ability that Frances had begun to think was genuinely extraordinary, and she had written to a school administrator in Austin about it, the kind of careful, advocating letter she knew how to write from her years of teaching, because Thomas Wallace deserved to have the full range of his abilities recognized, and she was the person in a position to make sure that happened. Clara, at 13, had transformed from a struggling reader into a passionate one, and could often be found in corners with books when she was supposed to be doing something else. The twins at 10 were a continued education in the infinite variety of human personality, Samuel having taken a serious interest in horses that was developing into genuine skill, and Nora having discovered that she had a talent for drawing that surprised everyone, including herself. Frances gave birth on the 28th of May, 1884, to a boy. He was, in Roy's carefully considered opinion, the most remarkable baby in the history of Calhoun County, Texas, an assessment that Frances suspected was biased, but did not try to correct because she was, if she was honest, fairly biased herself. They named him James, for Roy's father, with William as a middle name for Frances's father, and this choice pleased both sides of the family more than anything they had expected. Roy held the baby that first evening with the careful, wondering concentration of a man who had held newborns before, his younger siblings, but for whom this particular infant represented something of an entirely different order. He sat in the chair by the fire with James in the crook of his arm, and Frances watched from the bed, tired and peaceful in the enormous way one is peaceful after accomplishing something enormous, and the look on Roy's face was one she knew she would carry inside her for the rest of her life. Clara and Eliza helped through the first weeks, Eliza having come back to stay for a time because the practical matter of a new baby was not something either Roy or Frances needed to navigate entirely without support. The twins were both fascinated and eventually dismissive of the baby, having determined within several days that newborns were not particularly interesting from an activity standpoint, and that he would need some time to become worth engaging with. Thomas held him once with great solemnity and looked at Frances and said, "He's very small," which was both accurate and not wrong. The years settled into a shape that was the shape of a real life, meaning they were not uncomplicated or without difficulty, but they were good in the way that things built with genuine effort and real love are good. Roy continued to expand what he was doing with horses, his reputation growing in the county as a man who could train a difficult animal without breaking its spirit, which was a skill not everyone had, and not everyone even understood as a skill. Frances started teaching again in a more formal sense when it became clear that several of the neighboring families were having the same trouble getting their children to the Victoria school that the Wallaces had initially had, and she organized a small schoolroom on the homestead that operated 3 days a week and served 8 children at its peak, including her own. They had another child in 1886, a second boy, whom they named Robert, and he was a fundamentally different creature from James despite sharing both parents, rounder and noisier and more immediately determined about his preferences. And Frances said he reminded her of her own younger brother at that age, which Roy took to mean she was warning him. By the time Robert was walking, James had developed a serious attachment to following Roy around the homestead in the particular way of small children who have decided a specific adult is the most important and interesting person in the world, and Roy bore this with patient tenderness and the quiet pride of a man who still could not entirely believe this was his life. Clara, at 15, was a capable and determined young woman who had decided she wanted to be a teacher, a decision she announced with the directness she had inherited from Eliza, and Frances took this as possibly the finest compliment of her professional life, and immediately began directing Clara's reading with that goal in mind. Thomas was 13 and the Austin school administrator had written back, at length, and there were real possibilities developing that Roy and Frances were carefully and quietly managing, not wanting to put pressure on the boy but not wanting to fail him either. Samuel at 13 had become, as predicted, exceptional with horses, spending more time in the corral with Roy than anywhere else, and absorbing knowledge with the same naturalness that other people breathed air. Nora at 13 had pages of drawings covering every available surface, and a fierceness about her talent that reminded Frances, in the best way, of herself. Eliza and Hector had married in 1883 and had settled on a property not far from the Wallace homestead, near enough that Eliza was a regular presence in the life of the family, which was what everyone wanted, including Eliza, who had made peace with her own particular form of love for these people, which was devoted and demonstrated entirely through action rather than sentiment. They had their first child, a boy, in 1885, and Roy was an uncle in the full sense of the word, not just the occasional kind. The summer of 1887 brought a drought that was hard on the whole county, the kind of Texas summer that turned the range brown and made the cattle work twice as difficult, and tested the patience of every farming and ranching family within 50 miles. Roy worked through it with the methodical determination that was his nature, moving the cattle to better range when he could, working out a water-sharing arrangement with the Ortega family and 2 other neighbors, and not sleeping enough, which Frances could see and said so, because she said things directly to him that had not changed. "I'm fine," he said, one evening in August when she had come out to the corral to tell him supper was ready and found him still working in the near dark with one of Caldwell's horses. "You are tired," she said, "which is different from fine." "I'll sleep well tonight," he said. "You will if you come inside now," she said. He looked at her across the corral fence, and the evening light was doing something remarkable with the colors of the sky behind her, reds and golds that were the drought's particular gift, and she stood with her arms crossed and her composure entirely intact and the faintest suggestion of not quite a smile at the corner of her mouth. And he thought, as he had thought a number of times over the years, that he was an extraordinarily lucky man who had been improbably rescued by the mail. "All right," he said. He put the horse up and washed at the pump and came in for supper, and James climbed onto his lap before he had quite sat down, and Roy settled him there and ate one-handed with the ease of long practice, and Frances watched him, and Robert was in her own lap, and outside the drought was doing its difficult work, and inside the kitchen the lamp was lit, and the food was hot, and the life they had built together was all around them, real and particular and entirely theirs. In 1888, Thomas Wallace, 14 years old and the best mathematician in Calhoun County, by Roy's informed and somewhat biased estimation, received a formal offer of scholarship enrollment at a school in Austin that could properly educate him in the subjects where his abilities were genuinely exceptional. The letter came on a Thursday, and Roy read it at the kitchen table and had to put it down and look out the window for a moment before he could speak. "Roy," Frances said. "I know," he said. He picked the letter back up and read it again. "I know what this means. I know it's right. He'll come home," she said, "for summers, for Christmas. He's not leaving, he's going ahead." Roy nodded. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I keep thinking about the night after Mama died when I sat at this table with that tin box and tried to figure out how to keep 5 children fed and housed and with some kind of future. And I remember thinking that if I could just get them through, if they could just be all right, that would be enough." "And," Frances said. He looked at her. "They're more than all right," he said. "That's what I keep thinking. They're more than I managed to hope for." She came around the table and sat beside him and took his hand, which was what she did when they needed to be close without fuss, and he held her hand and looked at the letter on the table and let himself feel, for a full and unhurried moment, the particular shape of what he had made. Thomas took the scholarship. He left in the autumn with a trunk and a new pair of boots and Roy's handshake and Frances's hand on his face, the way she had touched Clara's face and Eliza's face, and all of them at important moments, gently and directly, meaning it. He wrote home every 2 weeks without fail, letters that were full of numbers and ideas, and every letter made Roy laugh or made Frances proud, which was roughly the same thing expressed differently. Clara turned 18 in 1887 and began training as a teacher's assistant at the Victoria Schoolhouse, which was the right beginning for where she was headed. She was living at home still and would until her own situation determined otherwise, but she was clearly and happily making her own way, and Roy's pride in her was the quiet, constant kind that does not need to be spoken because it is already visible in everything. Samuel, who had turned 16 in 1890, had become Roy's right hand on the homestead and in the horse training business, a young man who moved with the ease and assurance of someone who had found the work that was made for him. Roy taught him everything he knew, and Samuel absorbed it and began adding to it in ways that were distinctly his own. And there were mornings when Roy would watch his brother work with a difficult horse and feel something very like wonder. Nora at 16 had her drawings, and a future Roy and Frances were carefully nurturing, not by pushing but by providing. Frances had written to a woman in San Antonio who did botanical illustration work, and had gotten Nora an introduction and a correspondence, and Nora was doing work that Frances, who knew what real ability looked like, thought might genuinely matter someday. By 1890, Roy was 33 and Frances was 31, and James was 6 and Robert was 4, and the homestead was a working ranch that was managing well, and a schoolroom that was managing excellently, and a household that was full in every sense of that word. One evening in the late October of that year, they were sitting on the porch in the cooler air, James and Robert having been herded to bed with the usual negotiation. The range was dark and the stars were out, and it was a clear night without wind. Roy had his arm around her and she was leaning against him in the way that had become as natural as breathing. "I was thinking," he said, "about the letter I wrote to the Reverend in 1882. "What about it?" she said. "I wrote that I needed help with the children," he said. "That's what I thought I was doing. I thought I was solving a practical problem." "You were," she said. "I was doing considerably more than that," he said, "without knowing it." She looked up at him. His face in the dark was the face she knew better than any other, every line of it, the way it looked in the morning and at the end of a hard day, and when he was thinking about something that mattered and when he was watching James sleep. "Roy Wallace," she said, "are you telling me I'm more than a practical solution?" "I'm telling you," he said, "that you are the best thing that has happened to me and to this family, and that every single day I am aware of that fact." She was quiet for a moment, taking it in. He was not a man who said things like that often, which meant that when he said them they landed with their full weight. "I feel the same," she said, "for what it's worth." "Which I think you know." "I know," he said. "I just wanted to say it clearly." "I told you when I first arrived that honesty was not a deficiency," she said. "You did," he said. "I should have added that it's also one of the most attractive qualities a person can have," she said. He laughed low and warm, the real laugh that she had been collecting since the summer of 1882, and she tucked it away with all the others. In 1891, Frances found she was expecting again, which she told Roy on a November morning with the particular directness she reserved for important things. He received this news with the same profound gratitude he had shown the first 2 times, which she found she loved about him, that each child was treated as its own remarkable event, rather than a routine continuation. She gave birth in June of 1892 to a girl, the first girl they had had together, and they named her Margaret. And Margaret was from her first moments a creature of enormous will and personality who had Roy entirely wrapped around a finger she did not yet know she had. James was 8 and Robert was 6, and both of them looked at their new sister with the same mixture of wonder and mild alarm that Roy had looked at Margaret with. And Frances thought that Margaret was going to have an interesting effect on the dynamics of the household, and was right about this within the first month. The year 1892 was also the year that Clara married a young schoolteacher named William Frost, who had come to Victoria from Tennessee. A good-natured and steady man who adored Clara with the uncomplicated, wholehearted devotion that Clara had always deserved and had always believed would come to her. The wedding was in April, before Frances had Margaret, and it was a fine day, and Clara was radiant, and Roy danced at the reception with a stiffness that Eliza teased him about, dancing not being among his native abilities, and Frances stood watching him try, and felt the particular love that comes from knowing someone completely, including all the things they cannot do. Samuel took over the daily operation of the horse training business from Roy in stages over 1892 and 1893, which was not a retirement so much as a redistribution of labor, Roy focusing more on the cattle and the range management, and Samuel handling what had grown into a genuinely substantial operation serving a wide area of the county. The arrangement worked because they were alike in the ways that mattered and different in the ways that made them complementary. Roy methodical and patient, Samuel more instinctive and willing to try something new. Nora's illustrations appeared in a San Antonio natural history publication in the autumn of 1893, small careful drawings of plants and birds that were reproduced in the printed pages with genuine fidelity. And the whole family received this news with a celebration that was out of proportion to the occasion by most ordinary standards, but that the Wallace family, who had learned from Roy what it meant to celebrate the evidence that someone was becoming fully and excellently themselves, found entirely proportionate. Thomas came home for Christmas every year, and each year he was more himself, and more the version of himself that Austin was making possible. And every year Roy watched his brother at the Christmas table and felt the satisfaction of a debt paid. Not that he had ever thought of it as a debt, but the satisfaction of a promise kept, which had been his mother's last request and his own first determination on that long-ago evening when he had sat with the tin box and calculated the future. By 1895, Roy was 38 and Frances was 36 and James was 11. And Robert was 9 and Margaret was 3, and the homestead was a ranch of real substance, and the schoolroom had evolved into a community institution that served 12 children regularly, and that Frances ran with the same clear-eyed efficiency she had brought to everything for the past 13 years. One late afternoon in the spring of that year, Roy came in from the range earlier than usual and found Frances in the garden with Margaret toddling beside her, pulling things out of the earth with great enthusiasm and no discrimination. He leaned on the garden fence and watched them for a while, unnoticed, because Frances was absorbed in explaining to Margaret the difference between a weed and a bean sprout, which Margaret was not finding particularly compelling. The evening light was the golden Texas kind, the kind that made everything it touched look like a painting of itself, and Frances was in it with her dark auburn hair, now with a thread of silver beginning at the temples that she did not bother about and that Roy thought was beautiful. And Margaret was covered in dirt and being redirected from one plant to another with patient humor, and the whole scene was so entirely, particularly, irreversibly his that he felt it settle through him to the bottom of his chest. Frances looked up and saw him watching. "How long have you been standing there?" she said. "A while," he said. She stood up and lifted Margaret, who immediately began transferring dirt from her own hands to Roy's shirt when he took her, which he did without complaint. Frances came and stood beside him, and he put his free arm around her, and they stood in the garden with the evening all around them. "She was eating dirt again," Frances said. "Nora ate dirt too," Roy said. "She turned out fine." "That's your argument, precedent." "I have 5 precedents," he said. Frances laughed, which was still, after 13 years, one of the sounds Roy Wallace most wanted to hear. "7, she said. "You have 7, counting these 2. 7 precedents," he said, "all of them good." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and Margaret grabbed his collar with both dirty hands, and the evening settled around them, golden and complete. And the range stretched out in every direction, and the ranch was solid, and the children were scattered and near and flourishing in their various ways, and the life that had been built out of grief and responsibility, and 5 small children and 1 honest letter and an April stage ride and the slow, certain gravity of 2 people recognizing what mattered in each other was real and whole and all around them. "Roy," Frances said. He said. "I'm glad I came," she said. He was quiet for a moment in the way she had always loved, the way that meant he was taking the thing seriously and saying what was true. "Frances," he said, "I am the luckiest man in Calhoun County, Texas. I have been for 12 years, and I intend to go on being for the foreseeable future." She lifted her head and looked at him, and he was looking at her with that warm, steady, entirely direct gaze that had been looking at her with honesty and love and patient attention for more than a decade. And she thought about the woman she had been in Jefferson City, sitting at her brother's kitchen table with Roy Wallace's plain and honest letter in her hands, wondering what Texas would be. She thought about what she had come for and what she had found. She thought about the first morning she had stood in this yard with 5 children looking at her with various degrees of welcome and wariness, and about the evening Roy had first taken her hand in the firelight, and about the day she had stood in this same kitchen and said yes to a man who had spent years giving everything to everyone else and who had finally, quietly, been ready to let someone give something back. She kissed him, there in the garden with Margaret between them getting dirt on everything, the way she had kissed him any number of times over the years, and with no less feeling for the familiarity of it, and Roy's arm tightened around her, and Margaret said something emphatic and entirely her own, and the last of the evening light lay gold across everything as far as the eye could reach. Thomas would come home for Christmas with a woman he was serious about, and eventually they would stand at a new ceremony, and Roy would shake his hand, and Frances would touch his face in the way she had always done at important moments. Clara would have 2 children who would call Frances Aunt Frances, and would arrive on the homestead every summer in a state of joyful chaos. Samuel would build a horse training operation that was known in 3 counties, and would marry late and well. Nora would have her drawings in publications that went far beyond San Antonio, her name printed beneath illustrations of remarkable delicacy and precision. Eliza would be a grandmother before too long, managing the fact with the same composed determination she brought to everything. James would grow into a young man who had his father's hands and his mother's eyes, and the particular quality of honest attention that both of them had modeled for him every day of his life. Robert would be the one who surprised everyone, eventually studying medicine in ways that Roy could not quite follow, but that he funded and supported with total conviction. Margaret would be exactly who she was already becoming, which was formidable and joyful and entirely her own. And Roy Wallace, who had stood over his mother's grave at 22 with 5 small children behind him, and a tin box with not enough money in it, and a door closing in his chest, who had worked every day for years without complaint and without rest, and without any consideration for his own wants, because there was no room for such things, who had sat down one evening in 1882 and written a plain, an honest letter to a woman he had never met, and in doing so had changed the entire direction of his life without knowing it. That man would sit on his porch on an evening in the autumn of 1895, with Frances beside him and the range dark and wide in front of him, and the sounds of his household all around him, and feel in the fullest and most complete sense of the word that he was home, not the home of the building or the land, though both of those were real and hard-won and mattered deeply to him, but the home of the person beside him, the one who had come for work and stayed for love, who had looked at what he was carrying and had not stepped back from it, who had sat down beside him on the steps and asked about his nights, and who had listened the way he listened, with the full weight of her attention, and who had said yes on a Christmas Eve by the fire with composure and conviction, and a warmth behind her clear eyes that had been meant for him specifically, and that had not wavered in all the years since. He reached over and took her hand in the dark, as he had done 1,000 times, and she laced her fingers through his without looking up from the stars, which was the kind of love that does not require ceremony, because it is already everywhere, in all the ordinary moments and the difficult ones and the golden evenings and the long nights and the breakfast tables and the garden fences, and the whole long-lived fabric of 2 lives that had been stitched together, willingly and irreversibly, into something that was stronger and warmer and more full of meaning than either of them could have built alone.